Greg Thompson. I'm a few years retired from the federal public service, spent a fair amount of time in Environment Canada, particularly in the Canadian Wildlife Service. And I'm pleased to have be able to join the PHGV Policy Committee today. My current role is as a contractor providing coordination support to the Canadian Wetlands Roundtable, working with an executive committee that has Ducks Unlimited Canada, Canadian Wildlife Habitat Canada, and also Canadian Federation of Agriculture representatives on their executive committee, and a much larger group on the steering committee that involves folks from both academia, from the private sector, from the resource organizations, and from wildlife conservation organizations as well. The purpose of this presentation today is to take you through some of the background with respect to the Wetlands Roundtable itself. I admit I'm a recent arrival, so some of this I'm reconstructing from what I've recently learned and from what Pat in particular and others on the executive committee have been so kind to share with me and tolerate my steep learning curve. And the topic today has to do with developing a national strategy for wetland conservation. We will, in the overview, go through some background, talk about development of the organization itself, accomplishments to date, and priorities and next steps going forward with respect to the development of a Canadian strategy for wetland conservation. First, background. I guess what this does is take us back, this slide takes us back to the Wetlands Conservation Council of Canada, formed in 1990 to administer NAWMP and advance wetland conservation nationally. I should add, for a number of years, I was privileged to have an opportunity to be a Canadian chair of the Canada-US Land Committee and was instrumental in helping bring Mexico on board with respect to the North American plan. NAWMP, as you know, is a highly successful partnership in direct habitat conservation. And to some extent struggles with outreach in terms of new partners and advancing policy reform. The plan is long recognized as a success, long recognized that success is not possible without policy reform. And I recall certainly in the first few updates to the North American plan, the first two that I was heavily involved in, we reinforced the challenges associated with the policy reform part of it. And we all recognize that there continues to be need for a lot of attention on the policy reform part. Without it, we can't buy our way to abundant wetlands or abundant wildlife, particularly wetland-dependent species. So that as the habitat conservation work continues, yet at the same time we see continued loss of wetland habitat, and it's certainly a concern for all of us, despite the positive impact of direct funding programs. That's some of the background on the policy side. Whoops. The Canadian Wetland Secretariat, some of you will recall Ken Cox leading, and earlier than that, other individuals. Jim Patterson was involved with this, and Clayton Rubeck and others were heavily involved with the Wetland Secretariat. Had a tremendous amount of, accomplished an awful lot in that period from 1990 through to 2004. It operated independent of government, but had a strong link to the Wetland Conservation Council, and certainly a strong link to the Habitat Division that I supervised in the Canadian Wildlife Service. Hosted a multitude of stakeholder workshops and produced reports, reviews, and discussion documents that are seminal today as we go forward. And they also demonstrated a tremendously positive collaborative approach across a range of actors and participants in wetland conservation, culminating in a wetland stewardship workshop in conference in 2003 in Ottawa. Out of that 2003 conference was a very, very focused piece of work that contained a series of 7, 8 steps going forward that today continue to resonate in the discussions about national approaches. The vision is an important one. Come out of that conference, increase in the quantity and quality of Canada's wetlands, where the ecological and hydrological functions are maintained or enhanced for the sustainable use of Canadians and nature. Those national strategies by 2003 included a policy framework in support of that wetlands vision we just talked about, broader collaborative governance structure to facilitate wetland conservation, capacities with respect to resources, science, knowledge, and tools, calling for a national inventory of Canada's wetlands, calling for integrated watershed management, calling for a high level of wetland literacy among Canadians, and a thriving and sustainable wetland industry. Those were the strategies that were called for by 2003, and I'm sure many of you on the call today will see those as continuing to be important and necessary strategies to pursue. So this is where the Canadian Wetlands Roundtable shows up in the story, and this section has to do with its development and building collaboration. There we go. I have a quirky mouse, it seems. Changing context. By 2013, everybody recognized a need to revisit that national leadership in wetland conservation, those strategies. And at the same time, conservation organization and resource sector partnership continued to be deemed critical. Ducks Unlimited led a 2014 Wetland Leadership Workshop, which explored many of the strategies that emerged back in 2003, basically confirmed that a lot of that stuff's really good and needs to continue to be worked on. And by 2015, a collaboration amongst Canadian Federation of Agriculture, Wildlife Habitat Canada, Ducks Unlimited, and others led to the early formulation of the Wetland Roundtable itself. The Wetland Leadership Workshop I mentioned to you was a two-day event led by Ducks Unlimited, facilitated, I believe it was the Intersol outfit that provided those consulting services, and basically said, you know what, we need to get back to some of those key visionary guidance that came out of that 2003 conference led by Ken Cox and company in Ottawa, and we need to renew our efforts with respect to collaborative engagement with all of the sectors, aiming in particular at a lot of outstanding policy needs that still needed to be addressed. Policy needs that continued to be flagged in various iterations of the updates to the North American Waterfowl Management Plan going forward. So, you know, here we go, the Wetland Roundtable sponsored by DU Canada, Federation of Agriculture, Wildlife Habitat Canada with financial support. Steering Committee, and this is continuing to be an evolving story, including Sphagnum Meat Association, Petroleum Association, CropLife Canada, BC Wildlife Federation, and others, as I had mentioned. AFWA is there as well. Dean Smith, I'm sure many of you know. It's been a significant contributor, along with Patricia Farnese from the University of Saskatchewan. Our collaboration so far has involved building complementary terms of reference and work plans with respect to what the North American Wetland Conference Council of Canada is doing and what the Wetlands Roundtable is doing. So there's clarity with respect to roles. The first having to do with NAWCC funding, advancing the science and technology, communications education associated with the NAWMP programs. Wetland Roundtable in comparison, broadening the partnership, advancing national policy, continuing to place a great deal of emphasis on policy development driven by science and, of course, technology, and communications with respect to broader wetlands conservation issues, needs, and values. So this is not, the Wetlands Roundtable is not a duplication of other efforts by other bodies, but instead an effort to broaden the partnership and to really deal with those systemic challenges at a national level from a policy point of view that are getting in the way of addressing continued wetland loss. And to be fair to the resource sectors, you know, some of the management regime the resource sectors are facing have systemic issues and difficulties in them as well that make it difficult for the resource sectors to meet their stewardship responsibilities. It's understanding what those obstacles are and working collaboratively with the resource sectors that the Wetlands Roundtable Executive and Steering Committee are of the view that this initiative will get us to a different and better place with respect to the sustainable use and management of wetlands in Canada. This view is an earlier strategic overview that takes us through earlier versions of vision and mission and objectives and program areas, all of which we have in the midst of updating and developing, and you'll see a little later on where we're headed with respect to these various components. A key theme in this is really responsible management, use, and conservation of wetlands based on sound science. Protection, conservation, and responsible management are key themes that all of the steering committee have bought into through a series of workshops that the Wetlands Roundtable has hosted since 2016. So accomplishments, which is just what I was starting to launch into, towards the National Wetland Conservation Strategy. Workshops 2016 to 2017 dealt with status and current needs with respect to wetland inventory, still a key outstanding matter, although we know across the country there's a smattering of inventories that have been collected under the Wetland Network site and are available. Contemporary wetland policy in Canada continues to be needing some update, as well current evaluation of the wetlands, ecological goods and services. These were 3 workshops: inventory, policy, and EGS, that CWR raised the resources and organized and held with an awful lot of support from Federation of Agriculture, Ducks, and Wildlife Habitat Canada. I should mention that the Wetland Policy Workshop had 2 separate focuses, one on climate change and the other on better understanding the issues and objections and challenges associated with a no net loss policy in a wetland mitigation hierarchy context. We'll talk more about that a bit later. Inventory workshop flagged the fact that, our national inventory is not in place. We have a bunch of ongoing initiatives, some of which have been captured, but that there's no clear picture with respect to the current status, the trends with respect to all the classes of wetlands and their goods and services and functions. I mean, you've heard it said many, many times, you can't manage what you don't measure, and the absence of an inventory was clearly a starting point for the Wetlands Roundtable when it comes to looking at what we need to be doing. Key elements coming out of the workshop called for a framework with some standard practices on delineation, classification, science-based using best technologies available, links to other inventorying and monitoring efforts on forestry, agriculture, greenhouse gases, data sharing, and ongoing ownership outside of government partner funded. Those are all the elements that were explored and considered during the May 2016 inventory workshop. Inventory considerations needs to be designed to support national wetland conservation objectives, needs a clear champion supported by industry endorsement that will facilitate sustainable development, landscape, economic resilience, sustained conservation of the wetland base, including meeting international conservation commitments, say through RAMSAR, along with the CBD Biodiversity Convention and climate change objectives, and sustaining our understanding of ecological goods and services as well. Next steps: define the elements of a framework, construct a value proposition for inventory monitoring, solidify support, define the leadership and management model. The next steps become part of the larger Wetland Roundtable work plan going forward, as do the outcomes of a number of other policy workshops, including the policy workshop June 2016, which identified broadly accepted principles that would inform the development of effective wetland policy in Canada, explore how wetlands will play a role in existing and emerging climate change policy. And think about it for a minute. Not only do we have issues from a species at risk point of view, in which over 1/3 of the wetland dependent species on the federal list of 500 species at risk are wetland dependent. And of course, so there are issues with respect to wetlands from a species at risk point of view. There are issues with respect to wetlands in many, many landscapes, including coastal wetlands in the Great Lakes Basin that have seen well over 85% loss since historic times. And at the same time, there are also some opportunities associated with wetlands and their role, dealing with water quality, water retention, dealing with carbon sequestration, and so on. So there are two elements to this business of the role of wetlands when it comes to both climate change, but also when it comes to species at risk as well. And the policy workshop explored a number of issues associated with impact compensation, including, as I mentioned earlier, no net loss. It determined that the current approach in terms of management of wetlands is far from ideal. We witness continued loss of wetlands and biodiversity. There's a variety of detailed documents that have been generated in a number of jurisdictions, not to pick on Alberta, but some of the detailed analysis there on wetland loss and the value of that loss is really quite fascinating, and it helps to strengthen the story about what's being deferred and lost as a consequence of wetlands disappearing. There certainly are trust issues in decline between governments, industry, agriculture, and conservation when it comes to wetlands. These can be overcome. We see exacerbated flooding and property damage in many parts of the country as a consequence of, in some cases, agricultural drainage that's somewhat uncontrolled. We see heightened division between landowners, particularly in Prairie, Canada, and we see a lack of legislative and regulatory clarity or certainty for all of the parties, including the resource sectors. On climate change, agreement that wetlands do have that significant climate change mitigation role and strategies in terms of greenhouse gas sequestration and in terms of green infrastructure. Next steps, develop consensus on a common goal for wetland policy in Canada. I would take you back to that 2003 vision coming out of that Wetland Stewardship Conference in terms of maintain and enhance the effectiveness of wetlands and their functions. No net loss is problematic, and it has been, as I mentioned, due to some of the concerns that industry has in terms of the feasibility of no net loss, particularly of function, given where our science rests, given all the uncertainties with respect to a one-to-one ratio and whether or not that actually is successful, and particularly if the one-to-one ratio gets traded off 100 miles away to some other location where the benefits of replacing that lost portion don't accrue to a locally and highly impacted landscape. Need to revisit and define some common ground. General consensus coming out of the policy workshop that protection conservation is needed through policies that balance sustainable development. The theme of balance is a very important one for the Wetlands Roundtable. EGS Workshop, same kind of examination and assessment of where we're at with respect to various of the EGS functions, need to strengthen the science associated with it, looked at the requirement to strengthen the story with respect to the value of wetlands presently and the services that they perform. Canada and RAMSAR, we've just added this slide just to remind ourselves that Wetlands Roundtable is already involved with the RAMSAR Secretariat here in Canada with respect to preparations for COP 13 in 2018. Actually, CWR has a role to play in terms of helping Canada address some of the challenges that have been identified in Canada's report, particularly in terms of strengthening national collaboration for wetland protection, conservation, and responsible management. So it may be early days for the roundtable in terms of its business plan, but it has been seen to have value already when it comes to issues like strengthening collaboration. And I think everybody's quite pleased with that outcome. Next steps, building capacity and developing a national wetland strategy. So we start with recognizing the opportunities. Canada is home to 25% of the world's wetlands. They generate well in excess of $20 billion in benefits to Canadians, yet wetland losses continue. Over a third of the 500 species at risk are dependent on healthy functioning wetlands. Wetland conservation, as we said, can play a key role in meeting national and international commitments, healthy water, wildlife diversity, flood management, and climate change adaptation. And a national wetland strategy is key. So next steps. Where CWR is at with respect to the overall business plan, now this is for the organization, is expanding the multi-sectoral partnership. There are portions of the resource sector, including in the ag sector, that we do need to go and talk to and seek their engagement in this national policy initiative. CWR sees itself as leading change management in terms of policies, programs, and investments, and not duplicating the efforts of others. Support a comprehensive national wetland conservation framework in which there are a multitude of elements that the CWR has already identified through those 3 workshops. Our role of CWR would be to provide expert advice on the science, policy, legislation, and best practices, and do so in a collaborative fashion. And from a business point of view, establishing a modest yet effective organization. Next steps in terms of building CWR capacity as an organization. We're currently validating, refining mission, vision, values. We're currently in the midst of refining the business model and the program offering to funding partners. That prospectus and the value proposition is an important part of our funding solicitation phase. Expanding the partnership is equally important in that regard. Establishing CWR on solid footing, well, it has to do with securing sufficient resources for core, and then setting priorities with our partners based on their needs and workshop findings, and securing project funds to start driving some of the components, including the inventory associated work. So that's where CWR is at from a organizational point of view. Growing the partnership is key, as we've talked throughout. And here's a bit of an enumeration that the steering committee has gone through in a 2-day workshop that we held March 21 and 22, in which we've looked further at where we need to go with our business prospectus. Our program elements on the science side: identifying knowledge and information management gaps for improved wetland sustainability based on sound science. On the management side, I should say there are 4 components to CWR's program as it's described today. Management side is really assessing, inform, and influence implementation of effective and efficient wetland policies, programs, and regulations. The next one is on stewardship. This is program element 3. Promote the protection, conservation, responsible management of wetlands through strategic partnerships for wetland stewardship that support wetland conservation and sustainable use regionally, nationally, and internationally. That's a lot of words, but it's a very, very important part of the story going forward. Then on the information side, communicating clearly and consistent messages that support a balanced approach to wetland protection, conservation, and responsible management. So I guess where we're at is we're at the conclusion of this presentation. My apologies for perhaps taking more time than was necessary, but that's the story. I'm not sure if our agenda has time for questions or how you want to proceed from here. We can plow back through some of the slides if folks want to explore some of the specifics. Hello, hello. Have we lost everybody?
I can hear you, Greg. If this is the no. We have a couple of questions that sort of come in. Provincial governments are key actors in writing and implementing wetland policy. How is CWR engaging provinces, especially on the issue of common national goal for wetland policy?
Well, let me just pause for a second, Ian. I'm not sure if we're able to connect and hear Pat.
Sure.
I'm happy to take the question if you'd like, but I just need some direction here.
Pat would like to try and jump in on this question. Go ahead, Pat.
Ian, forgive me, but I'm probably one of many who can't hear Pat at all.
Okay, Pat, they can't hear you at all. Sorry. We'll have to let Greg answer that question.
Yeah, sure, I'd be happy to.
Okay, Greg, can you go ahead and see what you can do about that question there?
Yeah, absolutely. The comments dead on. That in the case of virtually all of our conservation challenges in Canada and management of both habitat and wildlife, the huge part of the responsibilities rests with the provinces and territories. Our next steps going forward include soliciting.
We seem to have lost Greg's audio. There we go.
Really? Really?
Okay, go ahead.
Testing. Okay. I'll back up a bit.
You're clear.
Good. Provinces and territories, of course, are responsible for the vast majority of land and wildlife in this country and have a key role to play in their management. Where the jurisdiction to collaborate with the federal government, of course, is through venues such as Canadian Wildlife Directors Committee, wildlife deputies, ministers of wildlife, and other intergovernmental arrangements. Our steering committee presently has space for, but we've not yet identified a ex officio participant from the Federal Provincial Committee, Canadian Wildlife Directors Committee, but that's certainly on our to-do list. The second matter has to do with about the ongoing part of this engagement. We see engagement with the provinces and territories through their wetland specialists, through their wildlife director, as being a very important part of any kind of national policy development. And in due course, certainly we'll be briefing Canadian wildlife directors at an early opportunity on where we're at and looking to work closely with that committee over time.
Another question. Can you go into a bit more detail as to why no wetland loss policy is problematic at a national scale?
We're right in the midst of actually trying to put more meat on the bones of that answer right now. I think there's two conversations going on concurrently, and quite frankly, I think these two conversations are kind of confounding the issue. The first conversation is a question about what should be Canada's overall national policy with respect to wetlands. Is it simply maintaining through a no net loss approach within compensation where wetland loss cannot be avoided, so that at the end we don't lose any more wetlands overall than we have? Or is it maintain and enhance the quantity and quality of Canada's wetlands? I think that's one conversation. Maintain the status quo, or set as a larger aspirational goal growth of quantity and quality of wetlands in the country. After all, in chunks of the country, in the heavily developed areas, we've lost an awful lot of our wetland resource. The other aspect of the no net loss question is one that takes us into the practical business of actually trying to implement no net loss of wetland function within that commonly accepted hierarchy of wetland mitigation, in which compensation is expected or required where unavoidable wetland losses are going to be, are one of the impacts of a project implementation on the landscape. And at that point, the compensation for that loss becomes a very important part of the conversation, say with the developer. That conversation right now is one in which there's no national inventory to show us what our national trends are, is one in which there, in some cases, are no regional conservation objectives or landscape level objectives to fit a compensation arrangement into for a project X or project Y. And at the same time, because we don't have a really good fix on wetland function, it's very difficult to expect developers to be doing compensation and rebuilding wetlands with this lack of scientific knowledge. And to boot, there are those who argue that replacement, what compensation by replacement for wetlands such as fens and bogs and peatlands is an impossibility in any case. And it's a challenge for prairie marshes, but for these other wetland types, it's virtually impossible. So those are the dimensions of the conversations about no net loss, and I mentioned conversations plural because there really are two separate conversations. What's Canada's goal in terms of our wetland resource? Where do we want to be? And secondly, what best works in terms of the compensation regime under a wetland hierarchy mitigation scheme? Is a formal no-net policy the way to go? It appears that that's what a number of jurisdictions have decided by adopting a formal no-net loss policy. Nova Scotia, I believe, is one of the provinces. But there are other compensation style regimes in place in Canada in which no net loss objective is also being achieved. And I think where we're headed with the work of the Wetlands Roundtable on this topic is to dig in further and develop a better understanding about where non-formal no net loss policies are achieving effective wetland loss compensation. That's really where our thinking has gone so far. I'm developing a more detailed project description, and I'm in discussion with the steering committee currently on moving ahead with a series of interviews with the resource sectors to better understand their answers to the question about no net loss, both from a goal point of view and from a compensation tool point of view.
We have, on behalf of the PHTV Policy Committee, I just wanted to say thanks for your presentation. There seems to be some good opportunities for collaboration between the CWR and JVs, and we look forward to staying in the loop with your work. So that was just a thank you for your presentation today. If there are no other questions, I'd like to thank Pat for his getting the slides together and everything ready today, and for his attempt to get in, and for Greg Thompson for pitching in and getting this presentation and doing the presentation on such short notice. I appreciate everybody's help today. I think this is our final webinar for the summer. We'll be starting again in the fall. Thank you everybody for attending. And we look forward to seeing you in the fall. Just one more thing coming through. Okay, thank you everyone, and we'll see you in the fall.
Thank you, Ian. Thanks for moderating.